It's Professor Buzzkill back again, busting myths, taking names. It doesn't matter how much work you do on Nazi Germany, there's always a ton more work. And last week we talked about women in Nazi Germany, but when we were planning these shows, we realized that was too big a subject to do in just one episode. So here we are with part 2 for women in Nazi Germany. And of course, our Nazi expert, our World War II expert, your favorite buzzkiller, Professor Philip Nash, is with us again via the internet. Hello, Professor. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi there. Always delighted to be here.
This is such a fascinating topic, and we ended the show on a quote. Thanks to Lebensborn, a Nazi policy about birth, we'll have 600 more regiments in 30 years, and that's been sticking with me all week, and I can't get it out of my mind. So there are all these policies that you talked about in that show, and all these sort of policy platforms, if you will, in that show, some of which are followed more strictly than others. But one of the things we didn't discuss, and one of the things you're going to talk about a lot in this episode, is the elite women.
Sure.
Right? There were elite women, leaders' wives or girlfriends. What about them? What about the elite women in Nazi Germany?
Right, exactly. We've talked about sort of the broader society. What about what's going on at the top? Because, we've had people like Gertrude Schultz-Klink, who has an official title. What about the women who actually are closer to the center of power?
Yeah.
So like you said, wives and girlfriends typically. To generalize, obviously they were not monolithic. They were not all the same. Some of them were hardcore, devoted Nazis. Every bit as devoted to the project as any other male Nazi. Others were, we might call them more apolitical, right? They didn't necessarily, they weren't anti-Nazi, obviously, but they were apolitical. They just stayed out of politics. They didn't ask their husbands about work when they came home, right? They just were not interested one way or the other. So a couple of interesting anecdotes and sort of, I guess, case studies, you could say. One woman, I was interested to learn this, her name is Henriette Schirach. She is the wife of Baldur von Schirach, who was head of the Hitler Youth.
Mm-hmm.
She actually raised the issue of the Holocaust to Hitler's face.
Wow.
Which was extremely rare. In fact, this may be one of the only instances anything like this where she was chatting with Hitler, and she basically, the way she brought it up is that she had observed Jews being rounded up in Amsterdam. They were being rounded up and then put on trains and sent to Auschwitz. And, of course, it was a very unpleasant thing to witness.
Yeah.
And so she asked him about it. And as you might imagine, it didn't go very well.
No, yeah.
He basically lost his mind, and the Schirachs were never invited to the Berghof again.
Wow.
Which is a very typical as how Hitler would work. If you pissed him off, he'd basically exile you, maybe permanently or maybe temporarily, right? If you sort of lost favor with him. And of course, that's one of the reasons why so many Nazis around him, men and women, are so anxious to kiss his behind, right? Because they want to stay in good favor and keep their access, right? So as you might imagine, among the elite women, you had all sorts of there's a book I guess we can put on the bookshelf. It's called Nazi Wives, which is a pretty good book. It goes into all of this in great detail. I'll spare you the details. But you had all sorts of rivalries. You had alliances. You had affairs. The elite women, in some ways, is sort of a bad episode of Survivor or Big Brother House or whatever. I mean, it really has that sort of character to it. Some of incredibly petty. Certain women played certain roles in the upper circle of Nazism. So, for example, Joseph Goebbels' wife, Magda, she was, in effect, the de facto first lady of the Reich, even though she's not married to Adolf Hitler. More on him and his relationships in a minute. But to the extent that you had a quote-unquote first lady of the Reich, it was probably Magda Goebbels. Very prominent, very effective presence in public, et cetera, et cetera. You had Goering's wives, first Karin, who died, and then Emmy. So in the Nazi period, he had two wives, but particularly Emmy Goering, because this is Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, the infamous head of the Luftwaffe and all these other roles. He was the one with the ostentatious uniforms and all the glitz and the big parties and the big mansions and all that stuff. It really sort of over-the-top, ostentatious lifestyle. So Emmy Goering was, in effect, the empress to Hermann's emperor.
Gotcha.
Right? Hermann's sort of the emperor, right? In terms of his persona, his appearance, his presence. Remember, we talked about this in the Adolf Hitler episodes, where Hitler's affect is essentially relatively simple and plain, at least for the public. Yeah. Whereas Hermann Goering is all about the diamond rings and the medals and the unbelievably garish uniforms he has drawn up, right? There's that big contrast there. not surprisingly, Emmy Goering is in effect the empress of the Third Reich. I won't get into the details, but there's also this really weird triangle between Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and Magda Goebbels.
Oh.
Because Magda Goebbels, Hitler really liked her and sort of in a way admired her. She, I think, was at times sort of infatuated with Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's always pushing her husband, Joseph, to sort of get in and stay in Hitler's good graces so she can still be in sort of Hitler's presence. And the Goebbelses have 6 kids, I believe. So what? She gets the silver.
We talked about the medals last week, Buskiller.
She doesn't get the gold. And by the way, I forget their names, but all their names start with the letter H.
Oh, Lordy.
Yeah, you can go look it up. It's pretty hilarious. Goebbels' kids were, in effect, Hitler's substitute family. So, like, he would spend a lot of time with the kids. He would dote on them. I don't know if they called him Uncle Adolf or whatever.
Yeah.
So they were sort of a surrogate family. If, for whatever reason, Magda Goebbels and Adolf Hitler had an argument, and then she was sort of banished or made not welcome, that was like her whole world collapsed, and she was like just super, super depressed until she could win her way back into his graces. I mean, it's really, really pathetic, the sort of relationship they have, the three of them. But, it's not surprising, based on what I just said, that Goebbels is really the only top-ranking Nazi who hangs out in the bunker until the very end.
Right.
He and Magda, first they kill their 6 kids, and then they kill themselves. And with Magda Goebbels, people should go read about the last days in the bunker. It's amazing. And the movie Downfall, I think, actually does a pretty good job of depicting what it was like in those last days of the Third Reich. But Magda Goebbels is the one who basically knocks on Hitler's door just as he's about to commit suicide and tries to talk him out of it.
Wow.
Because, she really can't. She's one of these Nazis who cannot imagine a world without Adolf Hitler and doesn't want her kids to live in a world without Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
So they kill their kids and then they kill themselves. And then I have to share this other anecdote I dug up about Gerda Bormann. So you've probably heard of Martin Bormann.
Yeah.
He is one of the most important Nazis a lot of people haven't heard of. He's the head of Hitler, the party chancellery. By 1943, he's essentially the second most powerful person in the Third Reich. He's sort of the gatekeeper, the equivalent of the chief of staff.
Yep.
He controls access to Hitler. Super, super powerful guy. His wife's name was Gerda, and I wish I were making this story up, but you just have to check this out. In January 1944, Martin Bormann reveals to his wife Gerda that he finally succeeded in seducing this actress by the name of Manja Behrens.
Okay.
In other words, so keep in mind what's going on here. It says this to his wife. It announces to his wife, like, honey, I did it. I'm finally having this and having an affair with this other woman that I've been trying to get into bed. I'm cribbing this from Louis Fisher's History of the Third Reich, in case we want to know what I'm reading from. But it says, Bormann's wife was neither jealous nor upset by this moral indiscretion. In fact, she suggested a ménage à trois on the grounds that such an arrangement would set an example for other Germans, since a ménage à trois was more likely to produce more children.
Well, back to that again.
Yep.
Producing the numbers of children.
Yeah. Manja, she opined, that's the name of this actress, Manja, she opined, was too valuable, racially and biologically, not to bear children. And with perfect sincerity, Gerda Bormann suggested to her husband, quote, so this is a quote from Gerda Bormann, you can certainly be helpful to Manja, but you have to see to it that Manja has a child 1 year and I have one the next, so that you always have one woman around who's in good shape.
My God.
End quote.
My God. And all of this is not about let's have a menage a trois because we want to personally, sexually. It's because let's have one because it's good for the state.
Or at least that's how she justifies it. Yeah,
right.
This section of the book ends, one historian has called this the Nazi principle of crop rotation.
Oh my God. Yeah.
I mean, pretty much.
The way she's described
Can you imagine that being the response of any wife when they learn that their husband's having an affair? Oh, that's great, honey. We can produce more children this way. Once again, I think very, very telling.
Well, that's a discussion of some of the most important women who are around some of Hitler's most important lieutenants. What about Eva Braun, Hitler's amour?
Yeah, exactly. So when it comes to top Nazi women, she's obviously the elephant in the room in a way, right? She's the most important in some ways. So let me just give a little bit of background on this. Hitler's relationship with Eva Braun, I think in some ways is emblematic. It's sort of a microcosm of the way Nazis view women generally. So keep in mind, she was 23 years younger than Hitler. She was born in 1912. She worked for Heinrich Hoffmann, who was Hitler's official photographer. They meet, I believe, in 1929. By the time Hitler becomes chancellor, January 1933, they have a relationship,
Yeah.
an
Okay.
intimate relationship.
Okay.
They had adjoining rooms at the Berghof, right, Hitler's mountain retreat,
Yeah.
but he kept her secret,
You've never
certainly from the
understood
German
that.
public.
Yeah.
She was allowed to sort of, allowed access to the grounds everywhere when intimates visited, right? When the top Nazis were on hand, right, or maybe just the staff were on hand, she was allowed, some freedom, right? She could be seen hanging out with Hitler, having tea with him or whatever. But if dignitaries showed up or other public figures who weren't supposed to know, she had basically had to go hide.
Yeah. Surprising, shocking, weird.
Yeah. And if you're wondering, I think you mentioned this a minute ago, if you're wondering, like, so what's going on here? Why is he keeping his girlfriend so sort of rigorously on the down low? Partly this is about propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to preserve Hitler's image, right? Remember, as I mentioned a minute ago, he's or maybe in the last episode, he's an ascetic, right? He's not supposed to have any indulgences. He's not supposed to enjoy any sort of normal human pleasure. The concept was that he's, in effect, married to the German people.
Right.
In other words, he doesn't have time for normal human relationships, or he doesn't have time for a wife or girlfriend. He's married to the German people. Now, parenthetically, I think the Nazis also recognize that if he remains single, then millions of German women can fantasize about him.
Oh, I never thought about that.
Yeah, and apparently that was a thing. But so, I mean, it's not a huge number, but Adolf Hitler received, as far as we know, 8,000 love letters from German women.
Wow.
So, and I assume if 8,000 women are actually writing him, many thousand more are actually thinking about him.
Yeah, and that's the
Right.
8,000 that survive. Who knows how many?
Right. And in a way, this is not about power as much as it's about celebrity,
Well,
right?
exactly,
In other
yeah.
words, he wants to keep it so women are free to fantasize about him. And so that's another reason to sort of act like you don't have a girlfriend, even though you have a girlfriend who's your girlfriend for essentially, 12 years at least. Now, if you're wondering about Eva Braun, she despaired over this lifestyle, right?
Yeah,
She didn't
sure.
appreciate this, being shunted aside whenever, people showed up, companies showed up or whatever. And she didn't appreciate the way that Adolf Hitler neglected her, which he did. He would go weeks, if not months sometimes, without having contact with her. And that's the reason why she attempted suicide twice.
Yeah.
I think these are sort of cry for help type suicide attempts.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
By sleeping pills, trying to get attention, and they worked, right? He would redevote himself to her after she did it. But it's quite clear from all evidence that Hitler wanted her purely as a distraction.
Right.
She would never talk about policy. She was never. I mean, I don't think she was interested in doing it. But even if she were, he wouldn't allow it. Right? He wants someone to have downtime with, and where they talk about completely frivolous things. Like fashions or food or movies or whatever, right? He wants to be able to decompress at the end of a long day. He doesn't want anything else. According to Albert Speer, who was sort of Hitler's architect and then minister of armaments between 42 and 45, very powerful Nazi. According to Speer, Hitler would even humiliate her in this regard. So Speer claims he witnessed one incident when Hitler was in the room and Eva Braun was in the room, and Hitler talked about women as if she wasn't there. And he said, quote, "A highly intelligent man should take a primitive and stupid woman," unquote. Right? And I was thinking about this, contrast the place of Hitler's girlfriend in the Third Reich with someone like, I don't know, Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yeah, President Roosevelt's wife.
Or even Clementine Churchill.
Right.
Or most politicians, certainly in the Western world, right? Now, Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt obviously had a very problematic marriage.
Yeah.
But she had a great deal of political power, right? She was one of the most powerful first ladies we've ever had, before or since.
And Clementine Churchill was very influential with her husband. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, it wasn't official,
No,
but
yeah.
there's no doubt that she had influence. So this is the other end of the spectrum, like to a ridiculous degree. And so let me just to tie all this up, including what I said last episode, which is the officially powerful women had no access, and the women with access had no power.
So you're right. I mean, officially powerful women, like the woman we talked about last week, who's the head of the NSF, had no access to the high-ranking Nazis, and yet women with access to the high-ranking Nazis have no power.
Yeah. And I can't think of any better sort of summation of the place of women in Nazi Germany.
Wow, that's amazing. That's just amazing,
Yeah.
amazing, amazing. But what about women during the war? We hear so much about women's war work in lots of countries, the United States, Britain, other places. But what about German women during the war?
And it's a great topic. Obviously, 6 out of the 12 years of Nazi Germany were in World War II. So it's essentially half the history of the regime, and obviously super important in the history of that regime. Let me begin by busting a mini myth, which is, once again, one of these mini myths that I shared for a long, long time,
Yeah.
which is the idea that women in Nazi Germany had a low rate of workforce participation. In other words, women didn't work outside the home because of all the reasons I've spent these 2 episodes talking about, right? The women were not supposed to work outside the home, and so they didn't. And that the Nazis refused to tap into that resource the way other countries did. That's a little true, but if you look at like German women's workforce participation, in other words, the rate at which women work outside the home, it was actually quite high. And remained flat. In other words, going into World War II, so for example, in 1939, many more German women as a percentage of the population worked outside the home than British women did.
Gotcha. Okay.
So their workforce participation levels were high, and they remained high. What I think leads people astray is, or to the extent that the stereotype is true, is that women had a low workforce participation rate in industry.
Oh, okay.
Right. And I think that's where the misconception comes from, because we always, for good reasons, focus on Rosie the Riveter,
Exactly,
right?
yeah,
In other words,
yeah.
women taking traditionally male jobs like in industry or jobs that require a lot of hard physical labor. You had heavy use of German women, for example, in agriculture. Parenthetically, German agriculture in World War II remained relatively backward, right? It was not very mechanized. It was sort of, in some ways, peasant agriculture, very labor intensive.
Yep.
And so all the men who are leaving the farm for the military have to be replaced. And so this is where a lot of the women working outside the home go to work. They work on farms. Here's once again where you see maybe not the ideological hash, but the organizational hash that was Nazi Germany coming home to roost. In terms of recruiting women to work outside the home, the Nazis had difficulty partly because of the success of their earlier propaganda.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Think about it. For years, German women have been told, you belong in the home.
Yep.
And now on a dime, they're told, you know what, we need you working outside the home.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the women had absorbed the earlier message and then become reluctant to work outside the home. And there were other issues too. So, for example, relatively well-to-do Germans were reluctant to part with their female servants. And so they would they would either require or talk to their female servants and say, look, you really don't want to go take another job, right? Just stay here working with us. Now, by the way, also parenthetically, a lot of those female servants ended up being replaced by slave labor from the East, including a lot of women, like Polish women and Soviet women who were dragooned into working on German farms and in German households, which is a whole separate story. But there was also very little use comparatively of women in the uniformed military.
Right.
And just for context, I mean, the other extreme would be the Soviet Union, where hundreds of thousands of women were served in the military. They served in combat roles. They were snipers. They were combat pilots. They were tank drivers. So, I mean, the Soviets were way ahead of even the British or the Americans in that regard. The Americans had about, 350,000 women in uniform. The Germans were very reluctant to do that, largely because of the ideology. There were exceptions. You had a lot of nurses and clerks who were in uniform.
Yeah, sure.
Right? And it was part of the military, but none in combat. So polar opposite from the Soviet Union. The closest they came was the so-called Flakhelferinnen, or sort of anti-aircraft helpers. In the last years of the war, the Germans were so desperate for manpower, they took about 500,000 women and put them on the crews of anti-aircraft guns.
Yeah, right.
So they're not on the front. I mean, some of them did get combat training, by the way, but they're not at the front. They're basically tending to the anti-aircraft guns that are trying to shoot down British and American bombers that are now systematically erasing German cities. A lot of them were teenagers. In fact, a lot of them were from the BDM, the Bund Deutscher Mädel. To that extent, their regimentation and their indoctrination had paid off now.
Yeah.
But the Nazis only do this very reluctantly, and then because they're scraping the bottom of the barrel at the end of the war.
Right.
They just don't have enough bodies to put in uniforms. At the end of the war, women were 5% of the armed forces. So that includes the flak helpers, nurses, and clerks. So if you want a number, it's about 5%. as in other cases, you saw the similar dynamic in the United States. You had typical male hypocrisy. A lot of these women I've just described, they step up to do their duty and to serve the Reich, but they were dismissed as Blitzmädel, in other words, women of the Blitz.
God.
Right?
Yeah.
They were accused by men of being sluts.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And you saw the same thing with the WACs, the Women's Army Corps in the United States, right? You recruit women into the military, and then you condemn them,
Yeah.
right? That they're
It's
sluts or
sick.
they're whores or they're lesbians,
Yeah.
right? And of course, by the way, this is from the same men who, of course, want to sleep with as many women as they possibly can,
Yeah. Yeah.
and do not hesitate to do that, both at home and abroad, particularly abroad. And yet, the women in their own uniforms, they sort of degrade them.
Yeah, it's
and insult
amazing.
them.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty much sign of the times. You know, these are men who want to have sex with or sexually assault woman after woman after woman, but these women, they're whores.
Yeah.
Right, great. The vast majority of women, of course, German women, were civilians and suffered mightily in the war, whether as air raid victims. You know, disproportionately, a lot of the victims of air raids are women because a lot of the men are not in the cities at those times. A lot of women, German women in particular, suffer as refugees.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the literally millions of ethnic Germans, the Volksdeutsche, who were forcibly expelled from Eastern Europe at the end of the war and after the end of the war, right? A lot of those people died. More attention is being paid to that now. But the women, of course, usually in war, suffer the additional burden when it comes to mass sexual assault.
Inflicted on them, yeah.
Inflicted on them. So the Red Army, notoriously, as it entered from the east in 1944 and 1945, they committed sexual assaults on a massive scale. I would point out, not that this makes it okay, but it's really weird to me that, in my view, Soviet rapes of German women get a lot more attention than German rapes of Soviet women.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't
There
know
has
that.
been some scholarship done on this, but it's very recently. We know for a fact that a lot of the Red Army soldiers felt they were justified because of a revenge motive, right? What
Yeah.
has happened
Oh,
to
yeah.
my farm, my family, my girlfriend, my daughter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's because the Germans were committing mass rapes in the occupied Soviet Union for years, including, I may have mentioned this in another show, including sexual assaults of Jewish women, which was a violation of Nazi law, which then led a lot of those soldiers to shoot the victim dead afterwards to cover their crime.
Oh,
yeah.
God.
So when the Germans were in the Soviet Union, there were a lot more rape murders than just rapes, at least as far as I know.
It just gets worse and worse the more you study. It gets
Oh,
worse
yeah.
and
No,
worse.
there is no bottom when you study World War II in certain ways. But my point here is that German women certainly paid the price for Nazi depredations in the East. There's no question. To the extent that the Soviets, now there would have been Soviet rapes anyway, but to the extent the Soviets, it was official Soviet policy, right, was to encourage these. And a lot of Red Army soldiers embraced the opportunity, let's put it that way.
Okay, well, so far we sort of talked about women in Nazi Germany as those who are working in the regime, but maybe not, especially among the average women. You know, they're not necessarily devoted Nazis. You might argue that they had to work, they were being told to work. They were, I don't want to say following orders because that's a term that's been misused.
Quite.
But, you know, they're doing what they're told to do. They're doing what they have to do. They're not necessarily ideological Nazis. What about the women who were actually perpetrators for the Nazi regime?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most important aspects of this that people may know less about, or certainly it's important they know more about it, partly because there's been some really good scholarship done on this recently, and I'll mention the book in a minute in particular that I've relied on here. Obviously, the women were not leaders of the Holocaust. You know, they were not architects of it. They were not in senior positions, but there were women who were perpetrators. Some of them are notorious. Some of them have their own Wikipedia pages. Some of them were concentration camp guards.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Yeah.
It is, and not just because there were women's concentration camps like Ravensbrück, but you also had female camp guards at other camps as well. So one particular one is Irma Grese, Grese. People should go learn more about her if they're interested. Victims referred to, or the inmates referred to as the hyena of Auschwitz.
Oh, Lord. Yeah.
She abused and murdered inmates as a 19-year-old. She's a 19-year-old camp guard. She was tried and executed after the war at the age of 22.
It shows you how these brutal ideologies ruin all kinds of people's lives.
Lest you think that only men are capable of these things.
Yeah, well, exactly.
I hope to disabuse you of this. Some were notorious as officers' wives. One in particular is Ilse Koch, Koch, also known as the Witch of Buchenwald. The evidence isn't 100% solid on this. She was accused of some particularly grotesque abuses, like, for example, harvesting human tattoos.
Yeah, I remember talking about this with you
making
before.
lampshades out of human skin.
Yeah.
She was accused of this. We don't know for sure whether it's true. She certainly was participated in the abuse of slave labor. She was certainly responsible for assaulting inmates. She picked out inmates to receive beatings. So she was a really, really bad person. She ended up hanging herself in prison in 1967. So she was a real bad actor, but no matter how you slice it. But we have a far fuller picture of female perpetration now and female complicity now, thanks to one historian in particular by the name of Wendy Lower. About 10 years ago, she published a book called Hitler's Furies.
Yeah, it's going on the Buzzkill bookshelf.
Absolutely. I highly recommend it. It's a terrific book. Really adds a lot to our understanding, really helps complete this picture I'm trying to paint here. Basically, her argument is that the German Empire in the East and the German Holocaust in the East was essentially impossible without the participation of women.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, if that's overstating it, it's not overstating it by much. So let me just go through some of the numbers in case, because that's a pretty extreme claim.
Oh, sure.
I mean, even if I'm not capturing her argument 100%, the idea is rather controversial. So here are the numbers that she puts together. She counts essentially 500,000 German women headed east.
500,000.
500,000, which is a really big number, especially for a regime which has a reputation for not really exploiting female human resources, if I can put it that way, right?
Yeah,
500,000. So who are these 500,000? It's over 200,000 German Red Cross trained nurses, 200,000 women in army support positions, so radio operators, clerks, wiretappers, etc. 30,000 SS and police auxiliaries. So these are women in uniform who work in police stations, local Gestapo headquarters, and prisons. 20,000 secretaries in the Nazi civil administration in the East. So keep in mind that, once again, Nazi Germany is a mess organizationally, including the occupation of the East. You had the SS, you had the army, you had the police, you had SS intelligence, and you had a civilian administration.
Mm-hmm.
In that civilian administration, 20,000 secretaries worked. And by the way,
Wow.
these are women who, on a daily basis, see stuff coming across their desk, which includes memos about shootings, roundups, killings.
Yeah.
So it's not like they're being kept out of the loop. Quite the contrary. They help make that loop function. The number also includes thousands of teachers. Teachers sent east, often to teach ethnic German children in German language schools.
Yeah.
And then also, finally, thousands of mothers, wives, and girlfriends who often accompany army officers and SS officers and other personnel when they're out in the East.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing. That in itself is amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, that list I found very eye-opening. Right?
Oh,
because
sure, yeah.
Because, I see this figure 500,000, I'm like, 500,000? No way. And then you break it down, it's like, well, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So all of the above helped with empire building, with Germanization. Because remember, like, for example, in the East, that includes areas of Poland where the Poles are being expelled systematically and German settlers are brought in. And this was essentially the plan for the occupied Soviet Union as well. Right? So empire building, I think, is a really important concept because we get the impression that the Germans come in and just start killing everybody, particularly Jews and communists. No, they're also building an empire.
They
want to
think it's going to
Germanize.
last. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And, they see German settlers the way we see homesteaders in U.S. history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so
Spreading
a lot of
the German civilization east.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of German women want to take part in that effort voluntarily. But it also includes enslavement and exploitation and mass murder. And so a lot of the women were participants in this or were aware of this or were accomplices to this, right? And that's sort of the way that Lower groups these people. She groups these women as witnesses, accomplices, and perpetrators. They included spouses. I'll focus on one particularly notorious spouse. Her name is Erna Petri. Mm-hmm. She was married to a relatively junior SS officer. And they both went east and they were put in charge of running a confiscated estate in Poland. So essentially a big working farm with a manor house. They were put in charge of it. She accompanied her husband on a roundup of Jews, and on one of these roundups, she personally shot 4 of them.
Wow.
So I don't think it's an overstatement. If you can picture this, you've got all these armed SS soldiers are rounding up Jews and shooting them. And one of the SS officers has brought his wife along. And essentially at one point, the wife sees her husband shooting Jews and essentially says, "Give me that, the pistol. Give me that so that I can kill some."
It's even worse. What you're about to say is even worse.
Yes. Later, she, on the farm, came across 6 nearly naked Jewish boys who had escaped from a train that was headed to a death camp. And that did happen, right? Some people managed to escape from a train. In this case, 6 Jewish boys. She took them into the house. She comforted them. She fed them. But when hours went by without her husband returning, she took them out to the woods and shot all 6 of them execution style, like a pistol bullet to the back of the head. At her trial post-war, she claimed that she had been indoctrinated and that she, quote, wanted to prove herself to the men, unquote.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting in lots of different levels.
Yeah.
She's spent most of the rest of her life in prison, I guess is the good news.
Well, let me ask you the big question then, really, or the opposite question. Did any German women resist the Nazis?
They did, not surprisingly. I mean,
Yeah.
what we're seeing here is that in big picture, you find German women everywhere, at least in some capacity.
Yeah.
There were women resistors, despite the enormous risks. And we've talked in some other of our shows about resistors against the Nazis. Sometimes they were little subtle acts. I like this. So apparently, if you were an anti-Nazi woman who wanted to not get in trouble for obvious reasons, what you would do is you would carry around 2 shopping bags in public so you could avoid having to give the Hitler salute.
Oh, right. So you have one in each hand so you can't.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So someone might come up to you and raise their hand and say Heil Hitler, and then you might say Heil Hitler, but you don't raise your hand because your hands are full.
Interesting.
Which, I mean, obviously that's a very minor protest thing.
Yeah.
I would also, since I'm all about the shameless plugs, I should refer listeners to an episode we did a while ago about the Hampels, this couple who resisted.
them, yeah.
Right, half of that couple obviously is a woman, Elisa Hampel. She was a sort of a resistance hero on a very, very small scale. More importantly, not really well known in my understanding, is the Rosenstrasse protest.
Oh, okay.
1943. This is in Berlin. Rosenstrasse is obviously a street in Berlin. Jewish men were rounded up in Berlin. These are Jewish men who hadn't been rounded up already because they had Christian wives.
Oh, I see.
So they were often the last to be persecuted. So if you're wondering, like, why are there any Jewish men of any type left in Berlin in 1943, that's the reason. So in 1943, these Jewish men were rounded up and incarcerated. Hundreds of their wives, who were Christians, protested publicly for a week.
A week?
A week.
Wow.
In public, in the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
Nazi Germany, 1943 in Berlin. They protested publicly for a week. Lest I remind the listeners, Nazi Germany is not a place where you have public protests of any kind because of the increase in cost. Now, by the way, apparently, I think it was Himmler, they considered, like, well, let's just deploy the troops and gun them all down.
Yeah.
Right, which is what you might expect Nazi Germany to do. And they didn't want the bad press. They didn't want it to lead to other protests. So they put up with it. And after a week of protest, the Nazis released 1,800 men.
That's astounding. And I didn't know anything about this.
Oh, maybe we should do a whole show on it. This was the only mass public protest against the deportation of Jews. And Holocaust scholars often ask the obvious follow-up question, which is, what if more Germans had protested more often against the Holocaust? What would have happened? We don't know.
Right.
I mean, it's just a question worth asking. We should also mention the White Rose.
Yes, people do know about this, some people.
Sure. They're one of the most famous resistance groups. They included mostly students and a professor or two at the University of Munich. There are at least 3 movies about the White Rose.
Yeah.
They're all quite good. I highly recommend them. Sophie Scholl was one of the leaders of this group. In fairness to the rest of the group, I think because she's a she often gets more attention than anybody else.
Yeah.
Maybe even unfairly.
Yeah.
It's not like she didn't found the group. She wasn't the quote-unquote leader of the group. It was more of a collective. But she did play a leading role in this group, and she paid with her life. And I should add a little background here because it's interesting for the purposes of this podcast. This was a group that issued anti-Nazi leaflets.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
They would basically type them up and then duplicate them using like a mimeograph machine or the equivalent.
Yeah,
And then they
early
would go
version of it.
secretly distribute them all over the place at the University of Munich, where most of them were students. They issued their 6th and final leaflet, which is the one that got them caught and executed. They were emboldened to do this, despite the risks, by a riot that took place at the University of Munich either a few days or weeks before this, that had been triggered by the appearance of a Nazi functionary.
Right.
He showed up at the university to give a speech to the assembled student body.
Mm-hmm.
And in his speech, I forget the name of this Nazi, he's not an important guy, but he gave a speech. In his speech, he condemned the women present, saying that instead of wasting time as students, they should be, quote, presenting the Fuhrer with babies.
There we are again.
It
never stops.
He's towing the official line. And then in his next comments, he said that his adjutants, his assistants in the Nazi party, this guy I think it was either a Gauleiter or maybe an assistant Gauleiter, like a Nazi party functionary for the region. He said his adjutants would visit the less attractive girls and ensure them a, quote, pleasurable experience.
Yikes. Well, we all know what that means.
Yeah. Right. In other words, you women who can't find a man, relax. You can have a baby too. My men will be happy to help you out.
Oh, my goodness.
As you might imagine, a lot of the women in the hall were outraged. I'm pretty sure they bolted. They started protesting. And a lot of male students joined them in protest, not just in the hall, but outside the hall later. And this is referred to, you can find the text of all the leaflets online, by the way. This is referred to in the 6th leaflet. And it's my understanding that the White Rose, the group, they were emboldened by this. In other words, they took this incident, unfortunately for them, as sort of indication that the broader public was sort of ripe for resistance in a way, right? That wasn't true, right? This has just turned out to be a sort of a one-off. But anyway, it's interesting that helped then provoke them to drop this last leaflet, which then got them caught and executed by guillotine.
When they execute you by guillotine, they're purposely using an old-fashioned device to make
we talked
it
about
more
this. We
brutal.
talked about Roland Freisler in one of our POS Saturdays way back in the day. Have we managed to mention every single podcast we've done in the past in this?
No.
We're trying. Anyway, as in society, so in the resistance, women typically had secondary roles. But keep in mind, before I move on, that Nazi policy, it was called Sippenhaft. Basically, they would officially hold family members responsible for the alleged misdeeds of one member of the family. So you saw this, for example, after Tom Cruise tried to blow up Hitler on July 20th, 1944. I'm referring to that movie Valkyrie, of course.
But yeah.
They punished a lot, or they certainly incarcerated a lot of family members. And you will also recall from our Rommel episode, one of the reasons he commits suicide is he knew that his family might be punished, not just him. Right? And I'm pointing that out here because even if you were a woman not formally in the resistance, you were often vulnerable to pushback and ferocious countermeasures if your boyfriend or son or husband was involved in the resistance. So women got caught up in this in that way as well.
Again, it's just, the more you study Nazi Germany, the worse it gets.
There is no bottom.
Now, Professor, this is hard to do. It's just hard to do, especially since we've done 2 full episodes of it. But if you were to sum it up, how would you sum it up?
How would I sum up the unsum-upable?
Yeah, right.
I would make it may be a banal point, but I do think it's worth repeating that there were no, how can I put this? There were no oases of sanity and reason in the Third Reich.
Right.
Nazi Germany degraded almost everything it touched.
Yep.
And despite their official view of women were no different in that regard.
Yep.
In other words, even with the secondary or neglected role that the Nazis envisioned for women were implicated. Women were victims of, women took part in, women were affected by the Third Reich in dozens of different ways. Like men, a few women were brave, admirable, principled.
Yep.
Like the men, most women either turned the blind eye, benefited from the Third Reich, went along with it, or maybe even perpetrated. And by the way, I forgot to mention it, but if you look at all the women who went east, right, and I sort of liken them to settlers.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, a lot of these women are attracted by the fact that if you go to the east, there's a good chance you're going to live a better life than you did if you're stuck back on the farm in Germany, right?
Oh, yeah, you'll get a house. You'll get all kinds of stuff.
You get a house, you get servants.
Land.
You have a better lifestyle. And you see this even with the wives of those who ran the concentration camps. There's this
Yeah,
new
yeah,
movie. I
yeah.
didn't finish watching it. It's a movie called The Zone of Interest. It's about Rudolf Höss
Right.
and his family at Auschwitz, and it doesn't show you the camp. It shows you their lifestyle right outside the camp wall.
Yeah.
And like I said, I haven't finished watching it, but it looks like a terrific movie. And it really, I think it gets at this. So that these are people who live fairly comfortable lives, and they can tend to their gardens, and they can throw dinner parties, and maybe they couldn't back in Germany.
Yeah.
So that's another reason for women to sort of become perpetrators. But sort of, I mean, women are sort of an interesting sort of cross section of Nazi life in that regard.
Well, I can't imagine a better explanation than two things that you said. Nazi Germany degraded most everything that it touched, first of all. And the second thing is that women in Nazi Germany represented a cross section of Nazi life.
Yeah, right. They're the good, the bad, the ugly, just like the men are.
As we said, there's no bottom. This is one of these things.
Yep.
This is like Stalin. This is like Mao. This is like Confederates and like lost causers in the southern United States. The more you look into them, the worse they get because they are truly, truly inhuman. So let me thank you, Professor, for coming on the show a second time to talk about women in Nazi Germany.
Always happy to be here.
Buzzkillers, you know what to do. Go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com. Check out everything we have there. Go to the Buzzkill bookshelf. We've put a number of books on this subject because it's so big, not just one. So please go there and check those out. And we'll talk to all of you next week.